Are you tired of music that ends? Looking to spice up your listening life with quiet, sustained, 6-hour-long chamber music that is unlike anything else you've ever heard? Introducing Morton Feldman. Side effects may include long improvisatory sessions, living in Buffalo, New York, hating Gear Boulez, being lumped in with minimalists, poor vision, possible sexual misconduct, and moderate to severe death. Ask your composition professor if Feldman is right for you. Morton Feldman was born in January 1926 into a Russian Jewish family living in New York City, an area of Queens to be precise, best known for its large Irish immigrant population. The Feldmans were involved in the clothing manufacturing business, so they weren't super poor. He began his musical life at the piano at age 5, first with his mother and then at a school on the Lower East Side. His father, on the other hand, was never appreciative of his interest. At 12, he began studies with Madame Vera Marina Press, a Russian aristocrat in exile turned piano tutor. Her freewheeling, relaxed, and undisciplined approach to the piano was exactly what Feldman needed. He had been composing off and on for 3 years, and he needed someone in his corner to help encourage and nourish this side of his creative life. Madame Marina Press was Feldman's first exposure to the mystic harmonies of the Russian composer Alexander Scriabin. Feldman's circle in high school involved being around many similarly inclined artists. He played the double bass at the Upper West Side's High School of Music and Art and was a ringleader of a creative community of youngsters. Feldman's first strictly composition teacher was a guy with the incredible name of Wallingford Rieger, himself an American, but he'd studied in Germany, and so he took the emerging school of 12-tone and early serial composition much more seriously than some of his merely avant-garde American compatriots, such as Henry Cowell, who wanted to make sure his modernism was accessible. The young Feldman was attuned to music, but importantly he took the philosophy of music seriously. Rieger was considered one of the nicest guys in all of music, but his teaching style wasn't what Feldman wanted. He was too relaxed, and Feldman wanted to be pushed. He wanted to move beyond the merely Scriabin-inspired compositions of his youth. And so in 1944 he began study with Stefan Wolff, a student of Anton Webern, who had come to America for 2 reasons. One was that he was Jewish, and the other was that he was a Marxist, so the Nazis would have killed him for 2 reasons. While Wolff is probably better known today for who he taught, as opposed to what he wrote, his music began the process of experimentation into indeterminacy, that is, leaving elements of a performance up to chance devices. He did this in something called his interval studies, which are one of the first pieces of the modern era to be for an indeterminate ensemble. You could play them with really any ensemble you got together that could play the notes that he wrote. But Feldman did not get along with Wolff any better than he got along with Rieger. The problem with Wolff was that their musical philosophies just didn't sync up. Wolff was all about the man on the street, quite literally, how someone's music affected the common person. And Feldman later related a story about how Wolff opened the window in one of their lessons, and he pointed out to a guy crossing the street and asked Feldman what his music had to do with his life, how it could affect him. And Feldman looked out and saw that the person that Wolff was pointing to was Jackson Pollock. Wolff and Feldman not getting along had a lot to do with Wolff's teaching style. He didn't really talk about concrete terms in music so much as the wider philosophies. And while Feldman was interested in that, he wanted to learn the nuts and bolts, and he felt that with Wolff he was just spinning his wheels and learning nothing of significant substance. But they did like each other personally. They hung out outside of the weekly lesson structure, and Feldman got to know the other artists in Wolff's circle. Most importantly, this is how Feldman met Edgard Varèse. Feldman and Varèse hit it off right when the student needed encouragement the most. Yeah, I got to say, without Varèse, I probably wouldn't have been a composer. Hey, what if I told you about smoking in here? Oh, this ain't no cigarette. Really? This is, it's what you call an analog vape. Varèse wasn't just a fascinating character to Feldman, he was Feldman's idol, and moreover, he was actually nice. Remember, this is the guy who wrote a letter by hand to the then unknown Frank Zappa, lending him encouragement when he was just a drummer in his high school band. And although Zappa and Feldman went in almost totally opposite stylistic directions, we can see the influence of Varèse in both of their mature styles, because they both dismissed systematized approaches to composition. After high school, Feldman was expected to, and did, go into the family business of garment making, choosing not to attend NYU. Like Charles Ives, whose music he knew through Varese, he was freed from the financial burdens of having to make it in music. He had his 9-to-5 job, and then he wrote music and went to contemporary music concerts on the side in whatever free time he had. And this habit of going to concerts of contemporary music would end up changing the course of his life and his career. Because in 1950, he went to a concert given by the New York Philharmonic. In the middle of the program was Anton Webern's pointillistic masterpiece, the Opus 21 Symphony, this unforgiving work of serial composition. Early serial composition at that. After this piece was going to be the Rachmaninoff Symphonic Dances, but Feldman left the hall between those two pieces. Accounts vary as to why. Perhaps he felt like programming the Rachmaninoff after the Webern was being deferential to the audience and what they wanted to hear. Perhaps he didn't like the audience's reaction to Webern's piece, which, considering the New York Philharmonic crowd in 1950, is understandable. It wouldn't really be to their tastes, even if Feldman would have liked it. So he left the hall, and in the lobby, the otherwise deserted lobby, he met the only other person who also left the lobby at that time. None other than John Cage, and these two hit it off famously and immediately. Cage was an innovator in so-called indeterminate music, where elements of a composition will be left up to chance devices. This could be either on the composer's end of things, flipping a coin and writing down notes based on those procedures, or writing music where the performer was left to interpret and realize things up to their discretion. Or sometimes he'd write pieces where the random elements existed outside the composer and performer dichotomy, such as his pieces for multiple radios. Cage was all about finding the scripts of music history, despite era and style, and flipping them on their heads, really asking the question of what we mean by music. And this philosophy of music, many people considered him a musical philosopher more than a composer, meant that he and Feldman really got along quite well. And it was Feldman who got a piece of advice from Cage, which would come to define the Feldman sound. Feldman up until this point had felt an immense burden of history, and it was through Cage's friendship that he felt unshackled from this. He felt like he could write the music that he wanted to write without feeling like he had to continue on a great tradition of the past. Feldman got plugged into Cage's circle of avant-garde artists of all stripes, and was good friends enough with the man himself that they ended up living in the same building. So as we'll come to see, while Cage is sort of known as Indeterminate Man, he was not the only composer who was interested in allowing freedom for the performers. And we have to remember that Stefan Wolff was someone who was an early figure we don't really talk much about, who was also beginning to experiment in this particular direction. Feldman's interest in chants was funneled through unconventional notation, commonly known as graphic scores, an approach also favored by Cage and another American modernist, Earl Brown. Graphic notation gave a certain amount of freedom to the performers, and if the composer, without going through electronic media, had to go through a performer in order to get a piece out into the world, the only way to free the music is to go through the performer. So you free the performer and you free the music. This was an end-around approach towards loosening the strictures of music, because Feldman wanted to free music directly. These scores bore very little in the way of resemblance to traditional pieces, instead existing in these beautiful geometric, almost organic-looking shapes, where performers were given free rein over pitch. The score became more like a set of guidelines than actual rules. The 1950s and 1960s saw a great deal of experimentation on Feldman's part, because he felt like notation had an outsized effect on composition and interpretation, something that he would later refer to as a hierarchical prominence. Eventually, Feldman's notationally unorthodox approach centered around the use of a grid as a basic structural building block. And again, Feldman credited Cage as having an influence here, because he was at Cage's apartment, Cage was cooking them wild rice for dinner, and Feldman saw, because he had nothing else to do, some graph paper, and he decided that he was going to start doodling on it. And then he realized that he could use a graph as a fundamental building block of how he was notating things in time. What Feldman was interested in at this point was not really about the pitches, necessarily. He left the pitches up to the performer. He had certain parameters, low, medium, high, that sort of thing. He was more interested in the instrumentation and when these events occurred in time vis-a-vis one another. The grid was the perfect way to notate this. Cage was super excited, and Cage helped Feldman copy out some of his earliest pieces, which used the grid as the published score. And although Feldman would come to regard these early pieces as amateurish and primitive, he would continue to use the grid as a way to structure his music for the rest of his life. As we'll see later, even though he discarded the use of the grid later on, he still used it in the background. The abandonment of the grid was largely because he disagreed with many of his avant-garde contemporaries. He was still friends with Cage, but he disagreed with him with the idea that all sound was music. That was Cage's thing, and Feldman thought that there's got to be some kind of difference. It's almost like Feldman had jumped out to the brink in the 1950s with his graphic notation, and he slowly scaled it back until, what do you know, he's just writing in traditional notation again. The grid, for Feldman, was just too inviting. If that was going to be his published score, he had too much of a drive in him to make it visually interesting as opposed to producing the aural effect that he wanted. It was easier for him to make those decisions on his end of things, write a grid as a part of the compositional process, and then write the piece out in traditional notation, the end product where there's this underlying system that the performers don't necessarily see. Cage saw Feldman's later traditionally notated pieces as merely Feldman interpreting his own graph pieces, which, as we'll come to find out, is extremely astute. While Feldman saw all of his work after meeting Cage as the beginning of his true artistic maturity, he had less in common with Cage than he did with some of the other artists in Cage's circle, especially avant-garde artists, visual artists. Much as painters create static works that just exist, so too did Feldman.
Hey, you show me somebody who is not friends with a painter, and I will show you somebody who shouldn't be trusted.
Instead of thinking of music as organized sound that decorates time in a certain progression from one end to the other, Feldman's works have a sense of staticism and stasis about them, especially as we'll see when we get to his late pieces. Many critics have made this comparison between Feldman's pieces and the visual arts, and it's very apt, even though we have to still take it with a grain of salt because these two art forms are, again, different mediums. We have to consider them as an apples to oranges comparison, but Feldman's work is like an apple that looks a lot like an orange. That's a really weird analogy, I'm sorry. Cage believed that composition, performance, and the listener's aural experience were three distinct things. Feldman thought they were all part of composition. Before we stop talking about the grid altogether, we should probably take just a step back and talk about his most famous grid-utilizing piece, a solo percussion work called The King of Denmark. Feldman believed that the use of percussion was a calling card of a composer's style. He pointed out you could study scores and get a good look at composition techniques for other instruments, but less so in percussion. Percussion score study often tells you more about what a given composer does with percussion than how composers writ large can use percussion. He saw this as a very important distinction. Feldman said that it took him a while for him to arrive at his percussive language, especially in an orchestral setting, where he would use more instruments than would really be considered necessary. For instance, you often see a glockenspiel, one single glockenspiel in the way back of the percussion section, and it provides a nice color to a high line and maybe emphasizes some important notes. For Feldman, this was a cosmetic effect. He understood the glockenspiel as an instrument in and of itself, and having one glockenspiel would make that instrument stand out in a way that he didn't like. Much like having one clarinet would make the clarinet stand out if the clarinet had a lot of solos. One would not consider the piece to be a piece, but rather a piece where, like glockenspiel and orchestra, if you just had one glockenspiel, much as a piece with one clarinet and orchestra would be considered more along the lines of a clarinet concerto, or at least alluding to that genre. So his solution was to have three glockenspiels, or would the plural be glockenspielen? Ich weiß nicht. For Feldman, three glockenspiels was just the equivalent of having three clarinets. You were likely to hear that as a section, as opposed to just a cosmetic effect. Now, we can't consider this to be a way to approach music written by any other composer, in part because other composers did not use the glockenspiel in this way. He used three of them because he deployed them in places of maximum effectiveness and maximum subtlety. Feldman was most particular in rehearsals about where the instruments were on stage than anything else. He would rarely say anything else, and he was fond of bragging about how his knowledge of acoustics dwarfed that of most audio engineers.
Everybody keeps trying to tell me that the celeste is some kind of quiet instrument. It's not.
Yeah, well, there are hammers in there.
Yeah, like this one?
Where'd you even get that?
Look, you people might be under the impression that this guy's got his life together. He's not. I see what's around the bookshelf. It's a complete mess.
All right. Straighten up. I'll straighten up. But you need to behave. Feldman's ongoing relationship to the visual arts was so profound that his most famous work is for wordless choir and ensemble entitled Rothko Chapel, so named after a particular exhibit of the works of the American minimalist expressionist Mark Rothko, an artist with whom Feldman deeply identified. Looking at a Rothko painting is seeing something extremely static, and yet there's still something particularly visually enticing about it. It's not just there, even if it, for all intents and purposes, is just there. Mark Rothko committed suicide about a year before Feldman was commissioned to write Rothko Chapel. While the work is very much a music of place, composed specifically for the venue after which it was named, its somber and rarefied air turns any space in which it's performed into the kind of non-denominational holy place that Rothko himself hoped that his chapel would be. In the 1970s, Feldman's style changed once again. We're going to get to the specific details in just a second. But this coincided with his appointment at the University of Buffalo, not just as a composition professor, but as the Edgar Varese composition professor, his tribute to his earliest supporter, and one of his biggest mentors. Up until this point, music had strictly been a side hustle. His 9-to-5 had been in his family's clothing business. Ever the paradoxical figure, Feldman joined a long line of composers who insisted on the fundamental unteachability of composition. He constantly challenged his students not just to get outside the box, but he also felt like music shouldn't be an academic subject in the first place, and encouraged potential students to get out while they still could. He stressed that all students who wanted to study composition needed to have an enormous amount of talent just to break into the fields, and he despised overly analytical approaches to understanding what composition was. The only thing he really taught then was not composition so much as orchestration, what he referred to as composition's acoustical reality. To Feldman, who was playing the note was as important as the note itself. Composition and orchestration were so intimately tied that you couldn't just write music without knowing exactly who was going to play it. This contrasted wildly with the serial philosophy that all Cs, for instance, are exactly the same no matter what octave they're in. For Feldman, middle C was extremely different from a low C on the cello, if nothing else but because there are different instruments which can play these. One of the unique things he did in his lessons was to invert the traditional lesson format. Occasionally, instead of looking at music that students brought in and critiquing it, he would play through what he was working on and use the opportunity as a kind of teachable moment or musical parable. In doing this, all he wanted to do was force his students to take everything about a composition into equal measure. While he never once encouraged one of his students to write pieces in his style, he tended to take on students who were already producing pieces in something similar to his own aesthetic. Late Feldman works are very different beasts than pieces from Feldman's early or middle periods. Whereas pieces like Rothko Chapel would run about 20 to 25 minutes long, late Feldman works could run easily for hours on end.
I had a big discussion on the
Get back in your cage.
the 20-minute piece.
One side of a record.
I said, what the world doesn't need is one more 20-minute contemporary piece. You don't need it. We need a good piece about an hour and a half in one movement that really starts developing 40 minutes later when it's about time. That's what we need. We don't need a 20-minute piece.
Elliot Carter disagreed.
Who are we? I mean, we need an hour and a half piece that isn't played by anybody and not heard by anybody. I think.
So what would you rather have, a 20-minute piece not played or an hour and a half piece not played?
Same thing.
No, they all like that practical 20-minute piece, and it's all predictable, the form's predictable.
There's hardly a late Feldman piece that is as short as one of the longest pieces of a previous era. Just kind of a mental twister. Anyway, he considered the 25-minute barrier to be his generation's clock, and that there existed no parameters for writing music that burst that dam. There is also a great simplicity of approach in these late pieces. There are long note values, there's no sense of development, they're really static textures, they're overall very quiet, and they often have banal names. Violin and string quartet, oboe and orchestra, voice and instruments, all the way up to his final piece, piano, violin, viola, cello. These titles echo still life paintings, another important link between Feldman and the visual arts. The longest of these pieces is, without a doubt, his String Quartet 2, dating from 1983, which is about 6 hours long. 5.5 if you rush. From a technical performance perspective, trying to play something for 6 hours, no matter how easy it is going to be difficult. There's going to be repetitive strain injuries just from practicing the thing. Heck, doing anything for 6 hours is going to be tiring. You could sit down for 6 hours and you're going to get tired. From the audience's perspective, you can't get something out of a Feldman piece if you approach it with the same ears that you would approach, say, a late Beethoven string quartet with, where the deeper you listen, the more you're going to get out of that piece. It's also shorter if you listen to literally any Beethoven quartet. So Feldman's work is background music in a certain sense. It's sort of like Eric Satie writing his furniture music earlier in the same century. Although Satie thought of his furniture music as music to actively be ignored, something that, if anything, went on a subconscious level. Feldman wanted his pieces to be listened to, but he didn't want them to be listened to as intently. If you write something on a long time frame, you have to live with the piece more than you listen to it. Again, like the visual arts, if you look at a piece of artwork in an art museum, you're not going to spend a whole lot of time on any one given piece of art. You're going to get an impression about what it is. You may look at it and understand how it makes you feel, what it's trying to say, but you're not going to understand the finer points of it unless you have a print of it hanging up in your living room. Then you are living with the piece of art. You see it every single day, and that long time frame means that you will get something out of that painting that people who don't have it hanging on their wall will otherwise never notice. People who would see it in an art museum would walk by it, and they would never understand those finer points. So you have to write a 6-hour-long string quartet if you want to do the same thing in music, because you have to imitate that staticism. Even though his music is very repetitive, it's rarely if ever exactly repetitive. He understood that audiences would start to phase out of focus if they were subject to the exact same sound over and over again. It's just background noise, and our brains are actually accustomed to tuning out background noise that you wouldn't otherwise notice. Otherwise we go crazy. So people who go into chambers where it's super quiet go a little bit nuts because they start hearing things that we're supposed to tune out. Same thing happens in music. If you are exposed to the exact same thing over and over, then you start to tune out. You start to not live with the music in the way that Feldman intended. He knew when these moments were. He figured out where they were in the course of the music, and that was when he would insert variations. He would change the rhythmic pattern, he'd change the orchestration, he'd maybe make the dynamics a little bit louder from quadruple P to triple P, which is quite loud for Feldman. Feldman was very interested in asynchronous music, that is, music that doesn't quite line up. In pieces like his 1983 Crippled Symmetry, he achieves this by virtue of not having a score at all, thus alienating even the most basic phrases and gestures if they're occurring in relation to the other parts in a way that you just don't come to expect. And also, if you don't have a score, each performance is going to be a little bit different. He had his own little touring ensemble, and he would often play the piano in this, and inevitably he would play the slowest, and thus end last. But late Feldman is not just long, time-scale-wise. It's also universally quiet, inviting the listeners in. It's like someone who's about to make a speech, where you expect someone to start talking loudly and boldly and having moments of dynamic contrast in their voice. But instead, Whoever's on stage speaks slowly and quietly, almost like a whisper, very deliberately. You understand something about it that's something different. You understand the words in part because it's not in a way that you expect them to be delivered. Same thing happens in late Feldman. It seems to me that he was interested in the totality of sound, as opposed to just blasting someone away with something loud and shocking. He could have easily done this, basically the surprise symphony of Haydn on steroids, but he didn't, because that wasn't what he was about. Listening to Feldman's music is almost like you're in the role of a shy cat, and you're having to warm up to this unknown human. Soft sounds encourage quiet audiences, and their rapt attention toward these nigh indiscernible changes of color over these huge spans of time. Feldman felt as though there was far too much emphasis amongst his compatriots on the attack of a sound, that is, where the sound was in time, and being bold in delineating exactly where that was. Not only did he not care exactly where a sound fell, he was not interested in the attack of the sound as much as the decay of the sound. Compare his last orchestral piece, Coptic Light, to, for instance, a Boulez piano sonata. I cannot think of two more disparate pieces that illustrate this so well. Legend has it that Feldman swore at ensembles, who took his music slowly and quietly, and took great pains to do this, because they didn't play it slowly and quietly enough. The slowness of events is psychological, because Feldman was very attuned to how the harmonies that he wrote interacted with how they existed in time. He didn't write harmonic progressions. He put enough space between his chords that the harmonies existed in and of themselves. They were their own little self-contained worlds, and he could plumb the depths of those harmonies for a long time before feeling like he had to move on to the next one. Feldman spoke of his music as intentionally directionless and intentionally floating. Intentionally minimalistic, not in the sense of musical minimalism, but in the kind of aesthetic minimalism. That's part of the trouble with assigning the word minimalist to composers who don't actually write in a bare-bones style. The musical minimalists aren't minimalist in the way that Feldman is a minimalist, and yet Feldman didn't like being called a minimalist, and neither do many of the minimalists. I'm saying the word minimalist a lot, I should probably stop. To Feldman, Karlheinz Stockhausen had a lot of anxiety about what he did with time, if you consider music to be the decoration of time. Entschuldigung. Oh, hey everybody. It's Karlheinz Stockhausen.
Yeah. What's up, Stock?
Ich habe eine kleine Frage für Herr Feldman. Ja, be my guest.
Danke.
Was ist dein Geheimnis?
I don't push the sounds around.
Nicht mal ein wenig?
Nope.
Ich verstehe nicht. Mein Gott, das ist sehr seltsam. Bis später, Herr Klein. Mittagessen nächsten Mittwoch? Sure, I'll see you there. Tschüss.
Hey, you're telling me you go to lunch with that guy?
Oh, you're one to talk. We'll get to why in a minute. This move towards the slow and quiet might seem odd if we consider it as a turn of events, but really it's the continuation of the kind of music that Feldman wrote throughout the beginning part of his career. It's not a turn towards this kind of aesthetic extremity, it's an embrace of an aesthetic that was already there, and it was heightened in these later pieces. Even early Feldman has a tendency to just let sounds exist in the minds of listeners, and we can trace this back to a piece of advice that he got from Edgar Varese, who told him to keep in mind, whenever he was writing a piece, the time it took for a sound to get from the back of a stage all the way to the final row of the audience. From a purely physics perspective, this time is negligible, but this is more of a psychological thing than anything else. And Feldman wasn't unattuned to the problems of performing these long pieces. He himself admitted that his pieces of this length were not suited to traditional performances or traditional listening practices. Feldman's work is like being on a slow-moving train. Even if it's slow, the scenery does change. Helping matters here is that Feldman was okay with a kind of imperfection in his works. He was okay with things being misaligned, as we saw, but he was also okay with things being a little bit out of tune, if that out-of-tuneness helped add to the color of his performances. That is, if you look at Persian rugs, something he collected, there are intentional imperfections, and that adds to the beauty. That's part of the art. Again, another link between Feldman and the visual arts. And in rhythmic terms, he wouldn't just write pieces without scores to facilitate things not lining up. Even in pieces where there are exact measures which look like they line up, they don't really line up. Let's take a look at his bass, clarinet, and percussion, one of the shorter pieces of his late era, and see how this is laid out. If you're interested in this piece, I encourage you to check out Samuel Andreev's analysis of this. It's really top-notch. As you can see, the time signatures here do not line up, which means that the two parts will drift out of sync with one another, even if you're counting like crazy. Feldman could have had this renotated, but there's something psychologically profound in writing it this way. Remember, this is a composer very keen on how the way something looks impacts the way it sounds. I took the liberty of renotating the first system in a way which makes everything line up and the way it should. This would facilitate a different performance. This would be a more rhythmically accurate performance because even though there are a lot of triplets and a lot of crazy stuff in there that would make it hard to count and going between meters a lot, it's still something you could approach from a kind of proportional notation. It would be closer to what should be written if another composer was trying to do this. Feldman was okay with doing the opposite. As you can tell here, this is a grid, and a lot of his late pieces use this grid structure. He just puts regular notation on top of it. Feldman also did not concern himself with form, because he felt as though form was what controlled the layout of a piece up to an hour, whereas what took over about an hour and a half was scale, and these two were totally different. However, you can tell because there's this gap between 60 and 90 minutes that he didn't really flesh this out very well, and you can poke holes in this. For instance, if you look at Mahler's Third Symphony, this is usually about 90 minutes, and there's a formal design to it because it's Mahler. It's pretty complicated, but it's still there. He's not just working in scale. This rule referred to the compositional language of his time, as opposed to a hard and fast rule that existed throughout the entirety of history. But here, again, Feldman compared his musical approach explicitly to the visual arts, comparing his pieces to canvases, saying that there was a difference between purchasing a canvas of a certain size and trying to fill it up, as opposed to just painting and then realizing that your work needed to be on a certain scale. And form makes no sense when you apply it to the visual arts because form is how things are laid out in time, whereas scale has a lot more to do with the visual element and the visual component because it all exists at once, and if you're far enough back you can see the entirety of a painting. Form is not something that's really present in the visual arts for this reason, and this is perhaps why Feldman did not really think much of it as a term. So while bass, clarinet, and percussion is not notated using this grid technique, we can tell that he's using the grid technique as a way to lay out his music. There are 9 measures per system, and there always are going to be 9 measures per system, and it does not matter if the time signatures in one part don't line up with the other. Things look synchronized if you ignore the time signatures, they're just not in performance. He took great care to make the visual component of his scores very much a part of the piece, part of the experience. And so if you're a publisher and you're trying to typeset his music, problems have arisen if you mess with this structure of exactly the same space for every measure, exactly the same number of measures per system, exactly the same number of systems per page. Which is why any good Feldman publication from this late period is going to be a facsimile of Feldman's hand. Purging this visual grid-like element of the composition in favor of putting in nice page turns loses something in translation. Feldman was quoted in a lecture as saying that his music really wipes everything out and cleans everything away. He didn't think, and I think rightfully so, that there was any music that existed before that did that. So if Satie is the grandfather of ambient music, then Feldman is its father.
Father of ambient music, you think that you can reduce all of what I did to that? Get a load of this guy.
Look, I'm just trying to link it to some term that people already know to better understand you and what you did. What do you want me to call you? The thought leader? The intellectual mastermind behind all these ambient music musicians nowadays?
Yeah, you do what you want. It's your channel.
Feldman saw this through line in music history. Everything was composed of rules. 16th century counterpoint was as invented as 12-tone serial composition. And he saw composition just as a whole as composers going, I'm the composer, notes, now do what I say. The idea of not pushing sounds around was totally novel. No one had really done that before. This is why he admired Mozart. Mozart is the kind of composer where, even if you play Mozart to a non-musician, there's sort of an ease and elegance about his works. And even though Mozart took great pains to make sure his music was well crafted as opposed to just being light entertainment, there's an aesthetic similarity which crosses all cultural and historical boundaries. Feldman died in September of 1987 at the age of 61, but not before becoming very wealthy from selling a piece of art that he bought for pocket change in the mid-1950s for a whopping $600,000. He had long been comfortably middle class, and, according to Prague conductor-composer Peter Kotik, had always desired a certain degree of wealth and fame, but music was never, in his mind, going to be a path to the top. His student Bunita Marcus, about her more later, said that he heard music from a distance, that his work doesn't proselytize, but invites. His music had flown under the radar for many years, and was only in the last decade or so that his work truly became famous in the United States. He was always more popular in Europe. The orchestral pieces he produced in the mid-1970s were due to his residency in Berlin. Feldman always spoke of his pieces in intuitive terms, as hearing them first, whereas Boulez or Stockhausen or even Ligeti would be very mathematical and very analytical in their process. Feldman didn't like that. He wanted it to be a free kind of music. This means that a great many of his pieces resist analysis. It makes sense that the more analytically a piece is composed, the more analysis is going to help you. If you analyze a Webern piece, what you're doing is unraveling the threads of tone rows that Webern set out for you. Whereas if you analyze Feldman, you may come across something interesting, and you may not. And regardless of whether or not you do, you're not going to be approaching the piece in the way that Feldman perceived it, and you're not approaching it in the way he intended for you to approach it. Feldman saw his attitude towards sounds as militant because he wanted to free them from being encumbered by other extramusical processes. He long felt that knowing how something was made destroyed something of the magic inherent in the process itself. Hey, what do you think about current music theorists' attempt to analyze your pieces? Oh, I can't show that gesture on a family-friendly channel. Tonal relationships in Feldman are complex, but they're decidedly non-serial. He wasn't a tonal composer, but he wasn't really an atonal composer either. Again, he wanted to free sounds, and so he often focused on very small collections of pitches, figuring out different shadings and combinations within a very limited palette. But he never systematized this approach. In true Feldman style, he said that he dealt in sound, while Boulez dealt in system, a bold statement with a kernel of truth. Boulez considered Feldman an amateur who lacked the tools to make his music stand out, and let's just say the two didn't like one another. Feldman believed that his American contemporary, Milton Babbitt, would become the premier serial composer of the time when historians could look back at serialism as a whole, regarding Boulez and the European serialists as much too involved in getting inspiration from poetry, literature, and philosophy. Feldman stated an aversion to the theories of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, which dominated a lot of European philosophy, particularly when it came to the idea of dialectics. Hegel believed that the way to advance ideas in the world was to have an argument, or thesis, set up a counter-argument, the antithesis, and the combination of the two to form a new and more complete understanding of the whole was called the sublation.
Hey, are you gonna get to the point or what?
Keep your shirt on, Morty. Feldman's critique was that the European serialists were trying to do too much, trying to sublate complex dialectics in their pieces instead of keeping it simple like they should have. He didn't critique the end product nearly as much as he critiqued the methodology behind it. Composer and frequent Feldman performer Niels Vigeland, also a Feldman student and someone with whom I have had a lesson myself, points out the extraordinary absence of traditional concepts of development in Feldman's music, and he regards his entire output as expressing a unanimity of purpose. Traditionally, all composition prized the variation in pitch as a driving force behind musical continuity. For Feldman, and also Cage, this was primarily rhythmic. The same notes could be repeated in many different ways and in many different rhythmic profiles, just by changing one little thing here or there. It's not uncommon to find a Feldman score which focuses in on several small sets of pitches, or the same couple of timbres, but it's varied in such a way that you don't ever get exact repetition. There's little in the way of soloist-ensemble relationships. If Feldman's writing for an ensemble, he's writing for that ensemble as an instrument in its own totality. This echoes a sense of balance and of flatness, music in two dimensions. He even shied away from calling his compositions compositions. At one point he called them time canvases instead, and he once had kind of a crisis when he was teaching at Buffalo, where he thought that music may not even be considered art at all. In Feldman, sometimes you see unusual spellings of notes, sharps and flats mixed up, strange enharmonics that you might not otherwise expect, and if you're an editor, you may be inclined to fix some of these and make them easier to read. But for Feldman, using a sharp and using a flat, which enharmonically may be the same note, were not exactly the same note. The B flat would be shaded a little bit downwards, and A sharp would be shaded a little bit upwards. He didn't use this in a systematized approach. He didn't use newfangled accidentals to get exactly between two pitches. He wanted the performers to have a little bit of freedom in how they shaded the notes, echoing back to mean tone or just intonation. Feldman had horrible eyesight, and he blamed this on his obsession with reading. Although if it had to do with reading at all, it had to do with him trying to read in low light, so always keep the lights on, kids. He was notable for being a walking contradiction. Those who knew Feldman the man expected his music to be as loud and brash and bold as he was. Those who knew the music expected the man to be this kind of quiet guru. Nothing could be further from the truth. Few artists in human history have had their art so far removed from their own personalities. His tastes, too, were also unexpected. He loved the Sibelius symphonies, but he would rip into the Bartók string quartets. Despite his legendary self-absorption, Feldman was known for paying the tabs at restaurants for his younger colleagues, the stereotypical starving artists trying to make it in New York City. He often dropped hints that his pieces were about something greater, although that something greater is very hard to pin down. He saw his Jewish heritage as resting outside the overall Western tradition, and he felt alienated from Europe because he saw all of Europe, not just Germany, as being complicit in Hitler's rise to power. It's telling that he could have made a career of it in Europe purely as a composer, but he chose not to. There were things he didn't want to talk about, and his talkative nature in other subjects obscured this. About the only thing the composer and his compositions had in common was that both of them never seemed to shut up. Other composers were generally bemused by him. John Adams called him a lovable solipsist after he saw him talk at, not with, a table chock full of a who's who of 20th century composers. This is odd because if you listen to an interview with Feldman, he sounds methodical. He sounds very deliberate. He sounds like he's really weighing the meaning of every word that he says. Although, it's, to be fair, you're probably different in a one-on-one setting than you are at a party. Feldman said that he wanted to be the first great Jewish composer. Not a great Jewish composer, but the first.
Yeah, screw these guys in particular.
You know, I'd be careful, Morty. I know several Mahler fans who would not think twice about using this hammer on you.
Hold on, how did you get the hammer?
Because this reality is an illusion. And you know how Mahler loves hammers.
What did I do to deserve this?
What did you do? That's actually a pretty good question, because we have yet to get to the elephant in the room. Feldman wasn't just known for his outsized personality at parties. He was known to be quite forward with women. In 2014, there was a ruckus in classical music internet circles concerning allegations made by Bonita Marcus. Remember her, one of Feldman's former students? In an interview that was published in Italian. The problem is that sources on this are few and far between. There's nothing that really contradicts this, but nothing that corroborates it either. It's wise, I think, in the current political climate to take everything with a grain of salt. That is, to understand these as allegations and to take into account the seriousness of them, but also to make sure that the facts are the facts and that we don't rush to judgment. This is especially true when one of the parties involved is not around to give another side to the story. That being said, here is what we know. An interview with Marcus on an Italian website saw Marcus accuse Feldman of predatory behavior. This was further exacerbated by someone claiming to be her in the comment section of the American website Slipped Disc, which had posted a link to the Italian article. While it's most likely that the commenter was merely a troll operating under Marcus's name, this doesn't take away from the base allegations that were contained in the Italian interview. Just last month, that is February 2018, another interview with Marcus was published, and in that, she gave a little bit more clarity into what she was actually accusing Feldman of, some things that were lost in translation or that were sensationalized by the Italian press. She said that she felt that Feldman was being overly pursuant of a relationship, that she felt it was wrong for him as a teacher to pursue a relationship with her, the student. There was a power dynamic there that just made it highly inappropriate. On top of that, she did not reciprocate these feelings. and that she felt that Feldman's forwardness led to the breakup of her marriage to her then-husband. Furthermore, Marcus felt like she influenced Feldman's works in a way that went entirely underappreciated and unacknowledged. Feldman was one of the big names in music at the time that he had her as a student, and as they worked together and composed together, she would write pieces, and he would write pieces which were very similar. She felt like he was trying to copy her style in a way to woo her, and while this didn't work, he then got credit for these groundbreaking pieces late in his career that were not really his ideas, that Marcus felt were her ideas that he had stolen, and that no one paid attention to her when she said, hey, this is actually what I did. I came up with this. These shades of grey were not present in the Italian article, which is not good when we're talking about journalism which concerns these kinds of really sensitive topics. You have to be careful about what your words mean and say, and not to sensationalize anything. Feldman's solo piano work for Bonita Marcus has alone overshadowed her entire output. Searching for her name doesn't lead to her music, it leads to this one piece by someone that she doesn't really like. This has also stymied my research into these allegations. If you search Morton Feldman, Bonita Marcus, then the majority of the results that you get are going to be about this one piece. Searching for allegations or impropriety and those sorts of things also leads to Bonita Marcus's other interviews, which detail how she, through her music, has come to terms with her own childhood trauma. Even setting aside the allegations, we can at least agree that this situation is wrong. Instead of highlighting Bonita Marcus and her work, Feldman's piece is just another Feldman piece, something which adds to his legend, but subtracts from hers. Bonita Marcus is still alive and still an active composer, and I encourage you to listen to her work, become familiar with who she is, aside from just a name in a Feldman piece. You can work to help rectify the situation by familiarizing yourself with her and her music. And you won't be disappointed, her work is really great. This is a delicate situation and not one she seems eager to drag up and relive, so I disavow any attempts to contact her about this. I include this only for the sake of completion and to give a more nuanced view into who Feldman was as a person. I felt when I came across them during my research for this video that it would be disingenuous of me to ignore them, because there are people out there who rightfully take this seriously, as we all should, and me ignoring it would just not be truthful. At the same time, I want to emphasize that this is not a zero-sum game where we have to completely ignore Feldman in favor of Marcus. A lot of folks who learn that their favorite artist may be problematic, or in the case of some other composers, definitely are, they often come to see their work as being somehow tainted. But art is separate from the artist. At the very least, we cannot consider the two to be inextricably tied. There is a relationship there. After all, why do I talk about composer biographies and also summarize their music in these videos? There is a link, and you have to understand this as a whole. You can't understand the art without understanding the artist, but you can appreciate the art without endorsing the views or the actions of who wrote it. The last thing I want to do is push a Feldman fan away from music they enjoy, or a potential Feldman fan for exploring a universe they may come to enjoy. While Feldman is often and rightfully included amongst the greatest 20th century composers, his work also receives a relatively narrow scope of recognition. Even I'm guilty of it here in this video. In order for us to feel like we have talked about Feldman, we must talk an outsized amount about late Feldman, which is so different in style from anything else that exists in the Western canon that it receives most of our attention. Thus, earlier pieces, with the exception of perhaps The King of Denmark and Rothko Chapel, receive the short end of the stick, while the long pieces get a lot of recognition because they're long. And yeah, it's easy to put Feldman in a box of just being the master of the long tone, or as he said, Mozart without a comfy chair. Going deeper into this and understanding why these pieces are the way they are open up a goldmine of psychological questions that, for a fellow composer, is a great way to be interested in figuring out how you perceive music. Heck, for a listener, for anyone who's interested in music, understanding how you perceive it and how you listen to music is such an important question, and one that continues to bear fruit no matter how many times you ask it. And if music truly is, as Claude Debussy once said, the space between the notes, then it was Morton Feldman, this brash, 300-pound, super talkative New Yorker, who was the most musical of us all.
Yes, that is what I'm talking about.
Hey, you're still on probation, okay?
If you liked If you like this video and want to support the future of YouTube musicology, please consider purchasing some of my music on my Bandcamp page or setting up a small recurring monthly donation on the all-new Classical Nerd Patreon. I've sunk a lot of time into researching these videos, and especially in the past 6 months or so have been able to seriously beef up production quality, in large part due to a Bandcamp donation that allowed me to purchase that bookshelf, which longtime viewers will know is a significant improvement over this small little thing I used to have. Your help in sustaining this channel is neither required nor expected, but would be much appreciated. Now, where was I?